Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap, and today we are going to be starting a new book of the Bible for quite a while, probably for the next 20 weeks or so, probably a little bit more, depending on how we parse things up. We're going to be in the book of Judges. And so at the end of last week, I asked the Bible study just to do a quick poll of Old Testament versus New Testament. Like, where did we want to go? And a lot of people are really interested in going into the Old Testament. And so that's where we're at. And since last time we were here, we did Job, which is poetry, more philosophical text. And then we did, of course, James, which is a letter. I decided to do historical narrative because I don't think we've done one of those in a while, since Exodus, if I'm not mistaken. So I said, well, let's do Judges, and I think Judges is a really good book to do this study on because it's one of those books that maybe we know some stories from, like most people know Samson, maybe you know about Deborah or about Gideon, but a lot of people don't know the whole narrative and what Judges is all about, or how it really shows us kind of the depravity of the world, but also God's great love and his justice and things like that. So we started off with Judges 1 today. Great place to start. And just some context on the book, because it's always important to start like with what we know and what we don't know. So the first important thing is the name itself. Where does the name come from? Judges. Why is it called that? Well, it comes from the word which is used in the Hebrew to refer to the leaders of Israel during this time. So Israel is led into Canaan, into the promised land, by Joshua, who's kind of Moses' successor. Moses gets to the Jordan, he dies, and then the book of Joshua, which follows or is preceding the book of Judges, is all about Joshua taking the people and going into the promised land, conquering cities. That's where Jericho is at and things like that, and kind of setting it up and then telling the people, hey, you need to continue following God's commands. And then Joshua dies. We get a little bit more about Joshua's funeral and death and stuff in this chapter and the next chapter, but Joshua is, for all intents and purposes, out of the picture. And so he leads them to the promised land, he gets them there, and then he's gone. And so other people kind of step up. And in the beginning, that this hasn't happened yet in the narrative, but over the course of this, you'll see that God will raise up certain people from among the Israelites to lead them during these times. And so they're referred to as judges because they're kind of the judges of Israel, things like that. If you want to think of it as a system and how it works, you can kind of think of them as dictators. And I don't mean that as the modern sense of like Mussolini or Franco or something like that, or someone in some banana republic in South America or something. What I'm talking about here is like the Roman version of a dictator, which is where we get that concept from, which is in ancient Rome, it was a republic, right? So you had these two guys at the top called consuls, and they kind of ran the show. But during times of war and times of crisis, they could appoint a dictator, and a dictator had ultimate power to kind of do whatever they needed to do in order to win and to save Rome or whatever. There's a famous one called Cincinnatus. That's why we have the name Cincinnati. He was this guy who became a dictator and then saved Rome and then retired to his farm, gave up all the power, right? So the Romans lifted him up as a hero because he had all this power, right? He could have done anything, but he served the Republic, he did what he had to do, and then he gave it up. Some people in American history thought this was what Douglas MacArthur was going to do. There was some talk of him doing this back in the 1930s and 40s, which was never going to happen. But some people thought that was something similar to what might happen with him. And so that's kind of the role of the judges, right? They're these people that have the power, and sometimes they're over the power of Israel for like 40 years, or sometimes it's only a short while. But they're kind of these people that have been appointed by God to save Israel during a time of great crisis. And sometimes they're really faithful and good, and sometimes they're not. And you're going to see how that plays out over the course of this. Now, this book was probably written around the year, well, I will just say around like the 1100s BC. It's kind of hard to date it, but it's talking about events that go back to 1400, because that's kind of when the Israelites first entered the promised land. So they're talking about that time period. And they're also, you'll notice that there's this big emphasis, especially in this, and you're going to see it in what we have today, on tribes and the role that some of the tribes played, especially the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. So Judah is an important tribe. That's the one that Jesus is going to come out of. But also Benjamin is an important tribe. And when you read this text this morning, right, which I'll get to in a little bit, you'll see how that comes about. One of the best analogies I've heard for the book of Judges, if you're looking for a way to think about it, is as the Wild West. And I don't mean that as a perfect analogy, right? It's not like there's, manifest destiny or anything like that. But you can think of it as kind of being like in this place where there's a lot of frontier justice. There's no law to really speak of. And that a lot of people, that like the heroes and outlaws kind of mesh, like one of those type of things. Like when you think of the Wild West in the United States, you definitely think of lawbringers and things like that, but like and gunslingers and but also as bandits, right? As like train robbers and stuff are kind of held up as kind of these heroic figures in American culture. Jesse James, things like that, right? So it's like that. There's a lot of gray in the book of Judges, and a lot of injustice, but also justice going on. And you see how that kind of plays out and where that is kind of leading people, and how it comes about is really important. So we're going to do chapter 1. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to point out something. So first thing you have to notice is that the book of Judges is pretty violent. This is a story of a continued conquest in the land, right? Joshua is also violent, right? They're conquering cities and putting them to the sword and things like that. That's also going on here. Now, I'm not going to make a full apologetic for it, but I do know that lots of these passages are pretty complicated and things like that. But let me do it like this in the best way I can. In that time, one of the things that God establishes Israel to do is to be a judgment on some of the other nations, right? And the things that these nations were doing was pretty horrific. When we think about nations today, we kind of just are like, oh, they're just living in peace and harmony, and they're all being, all they have these nice borders and things like that. You have to remember that the nations that Israel is going in to conquer are these ones who are doing pretty abominable practices, even by the time that standard. I mean, this is way out of, this is a thousand years later, but when Virgil is writing the Aeneid, this Roman writer, he's talking about the Canaanites and the Phoenicians who are from this region and moved to North Africa. And he talks about, in that, he mentions how they sacrifice children and they sacrifice people, like human sacrifices, which is not even something the Romans and Greeks really did. There's so few references to it, but it's generally seen as like even too barbaric for them. And these are the guys who like leave children out to die in the woods if they don't want to feed them or whatever, right? And have ridiculous, huge slave empires. So like that's the type of nations that they're going on. And so God is using Israel as a judgment for them. Something that's important to remember is that you see it sometimes you definitely see it in Joshua. I don't remember if you see it in the book of Judges. You see it in the Samuels and the narratives of David and stuff like that. When these people repent and give up their practices, they aren't destroyed. And they're saved and they're grafted onto Israel. But when they continue to do these abominable things, the Lord brings justice by destroying their cities and putting people to the sword, right? I mean, that's part of God's justice. Something that we're very uncomfortable with, but like bad things need to be punished. Like murdering children, burning them in statues of Baal is not an acceptable thing to do. And anyone who does that, like, deserves to be punished for it. So that's what Israel is going in to do. That's part of their purpose, besides getting the land that they were promised, right? So you'll notice that they go in here and they're conquering people, they're fighting battles, and they're winning. You should notice who's winning, though. And so you'll see as it goes on that the people of Judah, right, do a really good job. God is with them. In fact, there's this really strange little thing in 19. It says, and the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, he being the tribe, right, because Judah's long dead. This is just their ancestor. but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. And that's not that's not saying that God was like stumped by chariots here. And it's like, oh, I'm too weak to fight these chariots. What it's really saying is that that they actually kind of went beyond the boundaries that the Lord had given them for their land. They were trying to take more. So they had the hill country, but then they tried to move into the plains and they were defeated. And it's just to say, God has set the boundaries. Don't go beyond that, because some people might get greedy, right? And you see also that there's this other tribe, Benjamin. So it talks about how he's with Judah, and then it says, but in 21, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. So that's how people are just that to this day. They're able to be like, oh, okay, so this is someone who's writing, and this is still kind of going on. So it must be within this time period. So that's why a lot of scholars put it in the time of David. Not when he's at his height, but maybe earlier on. And anyway, the tribe of Benjamin, important person who comes from that tribe, Saul. And if you don't know who Saul is the first king of Israel. And you're going to see here that Benjamin as a tribe has a real tough problem following the Lord. And so this kind of foreshadows the difficulties that Saul is going to have. Now, some like really secular scholars and stuff will say this is just this author covering, kind of doing a royal genealogy afterwards, saying, this is why David is a better king or whatever. But, and I mean, I think that is part of what's going on. I'm not going to deny that that's not happening. But I also think that if we are to believe that people are raised within cultures, right, then one can see the folly of Saul in the mistakes that his ancestors made, right? Because his mistake is going to be exactly what his ancestors are doing, is not following what the Lord is telling them to do, and ends up corrupting Israel through that, right? And so you can see how these things would cascade. So it might be that the person writing this is like, yeah, go David, this is where it's from, but also at the same time saying, well, it's not a surprise that Saul turned out this way, because look at what his ancestors did, that type of thing, right? So it's whatever. And so you have so I have these two tribes mentioned, and at the end you get a list of all the other tribes, and you'll notice, right, there's a recurring theme. 27, Manasseh did not drive out. Ephraim did not drive out. Zebulun did not drive out. Asher did not drive out. Naphtali did not drive out. And then the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back to the hill country. And so all of that is to say is that all these other tribes of Israel are not following what God is telling them to do. They ended up taking these people and turning them into slaves is what's going on, right? And exploiting them. And that's really interesting, because we would expect, if this is some sort of conquest narrative without any sort of justice behind it, God would be totally fine with them just taking these people and turning them into a slave workforce. But he's not, right? That's not what he wants to do. He's not trying to create Egypt again, right? What he wants his people to do is live in the land, worship him, and that is going to be a problem, because these people who have these abominable practices are now being integrated into Israel through this slave system, and that's going to have a real problem that we're going to see next week. So we're here. I'm excited to dive into the book of Judges. I love history. And even if you don't like history, the great thing about it is it's a narrative. So if you like stories, you can follow along, and you're going to see how this really shows us and impacts us today, right? One of the ways is how to view Jesus in light of this is that there's just so much injustice in the book of Judges, and people messing up and doing bad things. And it really just points us to someone who is going to be the perfect judge or the perfect leader, and who is going to right all of that injustice that is happening, right? And is going to hold us accountable as well. So we want to make sure we're actually following what he tells us to do. So that's what I have for Bible study today. I hope to see you guys tomorrow for a new thing. And have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Peace out.